Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ty, and I will be your moderator for today's program, How HR Tech Can Build a More Diverse and Inclusive Workplace, presented by HR Morning and sponsored by GoCo. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in the control panel. If they're regarding the subject being presented, I'll add them to the queue for questions at the end. Now I'd like to introduce your speaker, Berta Aldrich.
Thank you, Ty. It is so great to see many of you interested in learning more about how technology can help you create a more diverse and inclusive workplace. So like most companies today, you may be experiencing both the pros and the cons of DE&I in the workplace. And what you experience today can be correlated back to two things. Number one, preparation, and number two, tracking. So if you are prepared and you have the infrastructure in place, including the right technology, you will have a higher propensity to drive better performance within your organization, including increased revenue and profit, engagement, productivity, and lower turnover. If you do not have the right infrastructure in place, what we are seeing in the research is that it can have a detrimental effect on your organization and your people, including increased internal competition, conflict, degradation of your brand, decreased productivity, and increased legal risk. And where do most organizations sit today on their journey through DE&I? Well, the data would suggest that organizations moving towards employing a diverse workforce have the right idea, but most have gaps in their execution that is holding them back from experiencing the true power that diversity can have on bottom line results. In fact, in my research, I talk a lot about how companies are hiring for diversity, then expecting those very people to adhere to entrenched rules of conformity, which is creating friction and impacting a company's ability to leverage the power that diversity can bring to your workforce and your bottom line. But the good news is technology can actually help you illuminate both your greatest challenges and your successes so that you can move forward and break free from these outdated cultures and work systems and progress in a way that's natural to you, your values, and your goals. So today, we are going to focus on driving three key results for you. Number one, increase the value of diversity at your organization, which is the end goal of most organizations and companies today. Number two, while decreasing your risks. There are inherent risks of executing diversity, especially if your organization isn't prepared. So we're going to identify them so you can prepare before you fully execute. And number three, while increasing your team's engagement and productivity, which could result in increased profits. So our primary goal of our time together today is to provide you a window into how to maximize this moment in time to lead the change needed for DE&I to thrive in your organization through the use of technology while increasing HR's ability to strategically impact your outcome with confidence and value. So today, I'm actually going to take you through what we call an abbreviated strategic gap analysis. So we're going to start by identifying where most companies are today in their DE&I journey. And during that phase, you can benchmark where your company is and determine where both your gaps and your strengths are. Number two, we're going to identify best practices or your North Stars that will drive your greatest change in your organization. So step number two is where you want to go. And then step number three, we're going to pull it all together, and I will show you how the best companies are leveraging technology to keep the focus on and drive results through DE&I, or what's the plan that you need to implement in order to get there. To truly understand the power that technology can have on advancing your DE&I, whether you are a CHRO, a director of HR, or an HR manager, it's really important to have a good baseline of what most companies have experienced or are experiencing so that you can benchmark where your organization stands today while learning what to avoid and how to streamline your process. So let's start here. I get the question all the time. Where are most companies today in their DE&I journey? What's going well? And what is not being said or disclosed that is truly holding them back? And these are all very relevant and great questions that need to be answered. Because the reality is that DE&I has been around for over 40 years, and most companies are still at risk and struggling to hit a stride where they are realizing its true benefits. So my goal as a consultant or an executive coach is always to tell you what others won't, so your company can perform how others can't. And there is no greater time to get real about diversity than now and on this webinar. Because as you all know, as HR professionals, in order to create change, it's important to understand your true starting point while confronting the reality of your challenges. So let's go ahead and take a look at research to better understand the state of DE&I in our organizations today and why it's imperative to leverage technology to help you manage it. As I share with you where most companies are today in their journey to DE&I, you will be able to diagnose where your greatest opportunities are within your organization and how technology can help you. So the first greatest value and also greatest risk today is women in the workplace. Women have been this bedrock of your diversity efforts that has been in play for really a long time now, and yet very few women have achieved the highest levels of organizations. Why? Because companies today have two major challenges that they will want to address related to women. Number one, executives 40 years ago were not ready for the tsunami of women that entered the workforce or are entering the workforce over the next 5 years. Today, there are 40% more women than men graduating college. Black women are graduating college at highest rates in history. Women will be flooding our workplaces over the next 5 years, and most companies are still unprepared. So how do I know that? Well, number two, based upon my research and several other meta research out there, women today are at 2 times the risk of being targeted, bullied, and abused in the workplace than their male counterparts. Now, if they are a high performer, which means they have high character, or ambitious, are great leaders, are intelligent, 100% of them will be targeted, bullied, and abused in the workplace. Some today package these types of activities as toxicity in the workplace. And today, if your company wants to perform better, if it wants higher profit, higher engagement, less turnover, then you'll absolutely want to solve for this, because your high performers generate 2 to 3 times the profit of an average leader at your organization. But for women, the very people who are your bedrock of diversity, who can help drive this profit, that can help you fulfill your DE&I ambitions, are being mitigated and reduced in today's workplace. And what's worse is 70% of those who report the abuse will be retaliated against. And the downstream impact is affecting our workplaces in very significant ways. And we'll talk here in a little bit about how it's going to impact particularly the Gen Z generation. Women who have unresolved experience with toxicity in the workplace today are leaving at alarming rates. Most who experience a form of toxicity will leave your workplace within 18 months of the incident. Some never to return to the workplace due to effects on both their physical and their mental health. So to bring this home, you have record numbers of women entering the workforce who can drive positive performance and profit for your organization, yet have the highest propensity to be targeted, bullied, and abused. And for those of you listening today, whether you are in HR or these are your daughters, nieces, granddaughters, no one, HR or those sitting in the C-suite want to be a participant of this type of activity or want to encourage this type of activity within your workplace or culture. Your next greatest value and risk is Gen Z. So we recently had Catherine Minshew, who is the CEO of The Muse, on our Voices of HR podcast. And she shared research with our audience that unveiled the real reasons why employees are quitting. And you can find the full version under on the HR Morning website at the top. There's a podcast button, or you can certainly listen to it on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. And she shared with us that Gen Z, for them, the number one reason that they are quitting jobs today is what they coined shift shock. And she defined shift shock as the difference between what a candidate is told during the interview process about the company versus what they actually experience once they are hired. For Gen Z, that experience is shift shock. And upwards of 75% of Gen Z who experience shift shock will leave the workplace within 2 to 6 months. The second highest reason they are leaving an employer, toxicity. The same reason that we just talked about why women are leaving the workforce today. And so I did ask her, how does Gen Z define toxicity? And she stated, number one, disrespectful. Number two, non-inclusive. Number three, unethical. And number four, cutthroat. And if you can believe it, 80% of Gen Z have claimed to have experienced a toxic workplace, with females more likely than males to experience this type of behavior. And to add fuel to the fire, the Wall Street Journal recently reported that 55% of Gen Z respondents to their McKinsey American Opportunity Survey reported having a diagnosis or treatment for mental illness. So to compare that to another generation, age 55 to 64, in contrast, just 31% of that age group reported similarly. So Gen Z respondents are also 3 times more likely to contemplate suicide than other generations. And so their key takeaway of that article was that key stakeholders, including employers, may want to consider the sentiment of this emerging generation as they plan for the future. And it's something that I absolutely found in my research as well. The next group that adds the greatest value, but is also at the greatest risk today within your organizations, is DE&I leader turnover. So some of you may be the one person in HR at your company and may have acquired the head of DE&I as another job, including the other 20 things that have become hot button issues for you over the past few years. But I wanted you to know, regardless of whether you are a one-person HR shop or you have a company of 20,000, it's important for you to know what's happening with those positions today. So 60% of DE&I officers who worked within the S&P 1000 companies left due to DE&I fatigue between 2018 and 2021. 60%. Another 33% left in 2022. Gucci's head of DE&I left after 1 year. And all of this is really signaling this stark difference between DE&I intent and the execution and the support that HR is experiencing in today's companies. In fact, the Wall Street Journal just had a recent article titled "The Rise and Fall of the Chief Diversity Officer." And they stated that 2 years ago, chief diversity officers were some of the hottest hires in the executive ranks. And now they're feeling completely left out in the cold. Companies including Netflix, Disney, Warner Brothers, Discovery have all recently said that high-profile diversity, equity, and inclusion executives will be leaving their jobs. Thousands of diversity-focused workers have been laid off in the last year. So this trend shows enthusiasm for diversity initiatives hasn't always proved durable, with 1/3 of CEOs cutting diversity funding, and did so because they said it's no longer a strategic priority. So do not be surprised if you start encountering headwinds as you progress your DE&I efforts. But I would say stay firm, because diversity, whether it is a hot button issue today, is going to be a hot button issue tomorrow. And the companies that realize that and prepare for it will continue to find better ways to increase its value and eventually outpace their competition. The next greatest value and risk today for most organizations is the executive gap. So last week we had the head of data science at ADP on our podcast, and he shared with us that the data suggests that older white males are retiring or being retired at an accelerated rate. And who is replacing them? Women. And that initially sounds good for diversity for the reasons that I mentioned and for the workplace, but with one catch. Based upon the data I have, unless these women were trained and educated in the new key executive skills, such as strategy and business acumen, they, like most who have been promoted into senior executive positions, will have a higher propensity to have a very difficult transition their first 18 months to 2 years on the job. In fact, today, 61% of those promoted to senior level executive positions fail to meet their key objectives the first 18 months in the job. Why? Because they weren't prepared. In a recent report by Korn Ferry, 14% of individuals within the succession plan population in your companies today reportedly have the skills to ascend and be successful in the executive level positions, which in their paper included managing performance, so managing the people, and creating change, or strategic and business acumen. Both imperative skills to lead companies into a profitable future. Net, there is this very real executive talent skill gap and L&D opportunity, particularly for women and people of color being promoted today within your succession population. So now for some good news. This administration has passed several pieces of legislation protecting women and those with young families over the past 18 months. This is such a positive move for DE&I in the workplace, and we will list additional resources at the end of this presentation, so you can either gain deeper knowledge on exactly what the legislation entails, or maybe just augment what you already know and how you can remain compliant. Those include the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, the Speak Out Act, and the Pump Act. And again, this is great news to better protect women and families in the workplace, but it also presents a greater risk for companies if they're not prepared. So as we look at all of these challenges and opportunities listed above, here's the benchmark that you want to keep in mind based upon current state of where DE&I is today in most organizations. Most organizations have at least one of these occurring in their workplace. Most have all four. And the reason that I'm sharing this with you at the beginning of this webinar is because it's imperative for you to know what your challenges are so that you can expose your own challenges and gaps within your organization to create the change that you need to create these diverse, high-performing organizations. So now that we have illuminated all of our DE&I challenges for HR, what is the solution? How can HR capture the power of diversity and inclusion and foster a culture of inclusivity, even in a remote setting? Well, the key: allow technology to elevate HR's strategic position and impact in the organization. So how? Companies that are on the front edge of leveraging diversity to drive profits within their organization, you leverage technology. They leverage technology to systemize their best practice workflow, leverage data for dashboards to track teams or leaders or areas of concern, and even KPIs, and also to identify those top performers that you may want to keep and invest in. Those that yield the data have the power to create change. And HR can create change by using data to consult and influence the C-suite. HR teams today are sitting in this incredible leadership seat to drive DE&I change in our organization, and you don't need a formal diversity title to do it. So some of you may be thinking, I'm a one-person HR shop with 150 employees. How is this going to work? Or maybe you have 2,500 or 20,000 and are asking the same question. The answer lies in that most successful companies that are using technology today are bolstering their DE&I results. The common denominator is best practices are tracked via HR technology and communicated out to the C-suite and to managers, to frontline managers. And you can use this technology regardless of size. So it's always good to hear a real world example. So I think this is the perfect time to talk reality for a minute and give you a little bit of a story of the struggles and where one company decided to take their DE&I efforts through technology. So there was this organization that I worked with that was finding it difficult to gain traction with their diversity efforts. So we encouraged and they conducted research with their mid-level executives and their frontline managers and asked key questions such as, what does diversity mean to you? And how are you executing diversity on your team? And what the data concluded was that most struggled to understand what diversity meant, or worse yet, what was expected of them. It was ambiguous at best to them. So now keep in mind that the board and the C-suite had already discussed DE&I. They had goals and KPIs around it and had communicated their support both internally and externally. Yet there was so much confusion internally. They couldn't and they weren't achieving any of their goals. So now let's press pause on this story and I'll come back to it here in a few minutes. So now as comparative data, keep in mind that over 90% of boards believe they are making significant progress with DE&I efforts in 2022. Yet 40% discuss their progress at board meetings. Fewer than that are actually making progress. So what this company was experiencing is so normal, and I see it all the time. There is always this great intent in communication, but the difficulty comes in execution. So how can you pull that thread between senior leadership's intent and the people who can actually drive the results for DE&I? So now let's break down some of the processes that I use that you can leverage to set your company up for this kind of success. So now let's take a look at what are best practices that really are your guideposts or your North Stars that you can aspire or take into account when creating your DE&I plan. Remember earlier we talked about the challenges of toxicity within your organization today. And that toxicity is typically directed at your DE&I employees. A best practice that you can leverage that should be a component of your technology is early identification of toxic experiences and result in quick resolution. So keep in mind that 60% of toxicity is inflicted by a manager or an executive to a lower level employee. So why is early detection and identification important? Because you can yield up to an 80% success rate, which means you retain the diverse employee or leader and they continue to remain engaged if you act quickly and at the beginning of the toxicity. And most of you want to retain your diverse employees. You also want to be quick to address any leader who is not living your DE&I values. Leaders today yield so much power within your organization, and those who are behaving incongruent with your values and expectations are having these unseen detrimental effects on your productivity. which we are going to talk about here in a little bit. So quick identification and action by HR is imperative to protect and retain your DE&I employees. Another best practice is consistent messaging, or making certain that the story you are telling prospective employees from the very beginning matches your current culture and ecosystem. Case in point, back to the shift shock that we discussed earlier, with almost 75% of Gen Z leaving a job within 2 to 6 months if the job is not as advertised. And we're going to talk about how technology can aid you in creating a consistent communication and experience for all employees here in a few minutes. Today, learning and development is a baseline requirement and offer if you want to attract and retain talent, and that includes DE&I. For example, today, Gen Z is making decisions whether to take a job at an organization based upon their opportunity for learning and development, because they know that every job, especially those early in your career, are learning opportunities. Women executives are making decisions on whether to join your organization based upon what the company offers as far as onboarding. Are they offering a coach to help them onboard and acclimate to your culture and your executive team? And I would say, both as a prior C-suite executive who had an onboarding coach and now who coaches new women executives, this is a game changer for both women and diverse employees at a new company. And for existing executives, ongoing coaching and training is critical to alleviate the risk and legal issues as your workforce becomes more diverse. I am seeing too many examples of executives getting themselves and the company into legal trouble because they just are not current on the laws, the changes in laws, or cultural changes required of an executive leader who's leading a diverse workforce. Next, data. So keep in mind that data will tell you what your people won't. So for example, reasons for turnover, disengagement, or lack of diverse promotions. For example, if one of your leaders is consistently showing to have a diverse team, but only promoting certain genders or ethnicities or age groups, that is something that data can actually track and illuminate. Those companies that are making great progress with DE&I have this data at their fingertips and use it to help guide their efforts, and technology is the critical element that they are leveraging. As part of the data best practice, companies today are making great progress with their DE&I efforts because they are soliciting ongoing feedback from their employees. So in today's workplace environment, identifying and immediately addressing behavior may be the difference between a very public lawsuit, which has negative downstream impact to your company, its future, and your bottom line, or ongoing DE&I success. HR must have the eyes and ears across the organization to hold everyone to this higher standard of behavior so DE&I can thrive. So you may be saying, that all sounds really great, but how do I actually create a more engaged, high-performing, diverse workforce through technology? So now let's put all of this together. So we have talked about where most companies are today in their DE&I journey. We've now talked about some of the best practices that should be leveraged. And now we're going to talk about how technology can track both the great behavior and the best practices, and how you can employ it through technology. So as an executive coach, the one thing that I have consistently seen and experienced as a foolproof way to create change in an organization is to think and speak like the leaders, or speak their language. To do that, you must tell them things that they aren't aware of, but once they know, will act. Or in other words, your job is to drive the strategic agenda. So let's help you do that. One of the easiest ways to move the dial on DE&I is through HR technology. Why? Because you let the technology do the heavy lifting for you, and HR then becomes the interpreter, the owner, and the advocate of the data. So remember the story of the company I started with earlier, the one who had DE&I goals, but the research showed that the leaders couldn't define DE&I, let alone execute on it? So what were their next steps? So their HR team proposed a technology initiative that would provide real-time data to their people leaders so that they could track their progress. And during this debate, some in the C-suite were for it, some were against it, and a lot of them sat in the middle. So the debate included a couple of things. Number one, these numbers, as dismal as they were, could get outside the company walls because they still had a lot of their workforce working remotely. Some asked and really questioned, could the people with the data in their hands actually create the change needed? The answers were, the data, yes, absolutely could go external, and so HR and PR would need to maybe prepare for that or embrace it. There are some companies that are actually publicizing their DE&I numbers. Or number two, yes, these are the exact individuals that we need on board, frontline managers, to create the change. So HR found and they leveraged a technology that tracked their KPIs and their goals per leader, per team, per division, and as an overall company, so they could all benchmark over time how they're doing. And they provided training on these KPIs, which included engagement metrics around leading diverse teams to ensure frontline inclusivity, and how to identify targeting bullying and abuse. And what do you think happened to the results? Well, the needle not only moved, it moved. Trend lines improved, engagement improved, toxicity decreased, the number of engagements with HR fell, and best yet, they had record profits in year 3. So what was the first step that HR took to get the end result of using data to progress DE&I? Well, they created an employee experience map. Then they selected the KPIs for each one of those stages and tracked those. Stop. They created an employee experience map. Then they selected the KPIs that most aligned to each one of the stages, and they tracked them, putting the data in the hands of the people who could actually make the change happen. This process works whether you are a 50-person shop or have tens of thousands of employees. And the key to any employee experience map creation is to document the experience with your company from the employee's perspective. So this will help you illuminate bias, challenges, successes, and also teams that are employing best practices that you can then share throughout the company. So let's start by creating an experience map based upon the best practices and the challenges that we've discussed up to this point. So most that I consult with actually think you need to start at the beginning or during the hiring phase of the employee experience, especially if they are hiring a lot of new DE&I employees. I actually recommend starting in the middle, so that you can truly understand what your employees are experiencing. Remember the shift shock that we talked about earlier, where newly hired employees are told one thing during the interview and hiring phase, but experiencing something else, and then will leave within 2 to 6 months if they experience it? Well, we want to avoid that. So in order to influence change, you have to start with what is actually happening within your organization. So let's start with the category and the goal of inclusivity and engagement of your current workforce, or the middle of the employee experience. What can technology tell you or do for you at this phase in the employee journey? So let's start with the basics, right? Let's start with payroll. So your technology must execute your payroll on time and with 100% accuracy. Not doing so signals warning signs to your employees. For diverse employees or for your DE&I efforts, technology also allows you to track whether there is disparity in pay. So far, 8 states have salary transparency laws on the books: California, Colorado, Connecticut, Maryland, New York, Nevada, Rhode Island, and Washington. And several cities and counties like Cincinnati and Jersey City, New Jersey, have their own pay transparency requirements. And as of 2022, 42 states have enacted equal pay laws, acts, or statutes. However, as we all know, it's important to note that all 49 states and the District of Columbia fall under the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which prohibits pay discrimination on the basis of sex. So you not only want to ensure payroll is delivered on time and is accurate, but it also makes sure that it also helps you abide by the current laws, both city, county, state, and federal laws. Next is benefits. And this is an interesting piece of research that I had not known before. So during that conversation with Catherine Minshew, CEO of the Muse, she stated that the #1 way a prospective employee can truly learn about the culture and priority of your organization and whether you are committed to what you convey on your website and your job descriptions is through your benefits package. And technology can help you ensure a couple of things. #1, that you're capturing what is parity, what benefits parity is within your industry. And also, it's a best practice to capture the questions that are being asked during the interview phase. So you can consistently evaluate and compare your company benefits package to ensure it's competitive. Next is channels of feedback. So if you are truly committed to DE&I, and because of the toxicity that's running rampant in most of our organizations today, you must have anonymous and structured opportunities for employees to provide feedback. And then HR must have the power to act. Keep in mind that employees who work for toxic or bully leaders, those teams are up to 80% less productive. Yet most companies have profit goals. So employing a toxic leader is actually decreasing your profit. Now, on the flip side, if you have a great leader, in some organizations, a 10% increase in productivity could result in a 100% increase in profit. So bottom line, productivity matters. Companies that are committed to DE&I employ what I call a dual power system, where HR and leadership works in tandem to create cultures where DE&I can thrive, and that includes addressing DE&I degrading behavior immediately. So one company that I really uphold as a best practice in this particular category is, there was a situation where, or I guess they had structured themselves so that if there was even anonymous or non-anonymous reporting of a toxic situation, that report immediately went up to the head of HR. Any leader who was displaying unethical, toxic, or bullying behavior was reported directly to her. The decision on how the leader would be handled or addressed was made between her and the CEO together. And if it was found that the leader was displaying behavior that was inconsistent with their employee handbook, values, ethics, or culture, it was addressed immediately by her directly. So HR was not only at the table, they led the conversation and had the power to act. So channels of feedback is imperative, and so is acting on the feedback immediately. If you have ERG or employee resource groups, technology can actually allow you to keep track of their progress. So for example, are they meeting on a regular basis? What are they proposing? If you're going to ask employees to become part of the solution, which is what the whole benefits of an ERG group is, they must have the ability to drive or influence meaningful change. And technology can help you track that and also can help you help the ERGs progress their own agenda. The next phase is to track promotions and learning and development. So why do we want to focus on that in our employee experience journey? Because when you hire a diverse candidate, this is the information, A, they will most likely ask for during the interview phase that will be important to them. And it's also important for you, as we talked about earlier, to track this. Technology can help you track the percentage of diverse promotions. So for example, we have heard for years about the broken rung for women. Women typically are not promoted earlier in their career and lose pace over time to their male counterparts. Technology can help you assess whether you have a broken rung and then provide the opportunity to fix it. Now, this does not mean that you set quotas for diverse promotions or only consider diverse candidates, but rather the technology can help you identify areas of concern so that you can get to the root cause of the problem. Next is something I advocate for with my HR and C-suite teams that I'm consulting with. Align your diverse employees to your best leaders and teams. To increase the propensity of your diverse employee success, ensure they're aligned to your best leaders, and here's why. Your best leaders develop, care, nurture, and protect their teams. And that is exactly what your diverse employees need to impact your organization and to grow. Your best leaders create more great leaders, where your poor leaders open the exit door for diverse employees. So to increase your DE&I success and momentum, get strategic about who your diverse employees report to and make sure it's your best leaders. Next is turnover. There are 3 key metrics that you should have on hand to begin constructing your what I call turnover story. The first, percentage of diverse turnover versus the diverse hiring class that they are in. Make sure that this calculation is apples to apples, not apples to oranges. I've seen so many companies report much lower turnover rates because they are hiring in a lot more DE&I employees than are exiting. And that is actually not the appropriate measure. And of course, is going to make it appear that the diverse turnover is much lower. So to track the real number, ensure the turnover percent is based upon the time periods of when the person was hired. Then you can track time periods over time to determine if your turnover rates are improving for DE&I employees or not. The second is exit interviews. So regardless of whether the employee is diverse or not, you should always conduct exit interviews. Why? Because even the non-diverse employees may shed light on issues affecting diversity. Keep in mind that others may witness inequities, targeting, bullying, and abuse, but not report it to HR due to the potential blowback. So exit interviews may shed light on why the turnover is actually occurring. And third, track where your employees who are exiting, track where they go when they left your company. So what happens when you know that there is an employee that's leaving due to a bad boss, or let's say a toxic situation, because that's been reported to HR, but the person during their exit interview will not disclose that? Add to your database whether the person went to another role, whether it was a competitor or not, or if they decided to take time off. If you have a trend of people leaving one particular area of both diverse and non-diverse employees, and they are quitting and taking time off, that could absolutely be a clear indication of something more sinister occurring and warrants HR to investigate. Now we're going to answer the question that we promoted in our communications of this webinar. How do we eliminate bias from hiring and recruiting with one strategy? And the short answer is you need to create a system that attracts the right candidates while creating the best opportunity and chance of success within your organization. So how do you do that through technology? Well, number one, you start with the job description wording that is inclusive and invites diverse candidates. Ensure that that language becomes a boilerplate for all of your job descriptions. This also includes potentially minimizing the college requirement or allowing experience and performance to replace, let's say, an associate's or a bachelor's requirement. Number two, sourcing. Certainly continue to post on universal sites, but in addition, also place on sites in areas where diverse candidates will look. So for example, maybe an all-Black college alumni page or all women's colleges. Source where you can find diverse candidates. Number three, fairness in selection for interviews. So now that you have sourced in known areas for diverse and non-diverse employees, the key is to gather a diverse talent pool to select from. So to do this, technology can now eliminate the names and the pronouns during resume reviews. This ensures an unbiased approach to selection for your interviews. You'll also want to organize your interviews to ask a consistent set of questions of all candidates as well as track their answers. This will also help ensure apples to apples comparisons of the candidates. And certainly last, during the selection of and sourcing of your diverse candidates, some companies conduct assessments during this phase. You may use the Hogan assessment, or one of my favorites, the predictive index or predictive index cognitive assessments. You can insert these test results into your technology in order to eliminate or prioritize your pool of candidates. Again, removing the names and pronouns will help you eliminate any bias, or said differently, will help you level the playing field for your diverse candidates. So now once you have sourced the candidates, you've selected a base for interviews, you have interviewed and you have selected the employee, it's now time for onboarding. So first and foremost, set up payroll, benefits, and provide the employee handbook upon onboarding, provides stability, and also checks the box on the most important issues to the employee. Next, a best practice for increasing the propensity of an employee to stay with your company is to schedule a walk around with the leader, where the leader provides them a tour and introduces them to others. Next, you can also track frequent check-ins, and this should be both formal and informal check-ins from both HR and from their leader to ensure ongoing feedback and ease of onboarding into the role, the team, and the company. And also within the first few weeks, they should be introduced to the variety of ERGs at your organization. Feeling part of a smaller community can help with the transition and deepen the loyalty or longevity with your organization. So now that we have all these best practices placed onto an employee experience map, let's take a look at how we can use this in combination with technology to provide you with the insight and data you need to create a high-performing DE&I culture. So at this point, you have taken best practices and risks into account and developed this employee experience map based upon your KPIs. And here is the absolute best thing about HR technology. If you put the time and effort into truly understanding DE&I best practices and what KPIs you want to move the dial on, a DE&I employee experience dashboard will be an incredibly powerful tool for HR to drive DE&I initiatives. Why? Because you have the power of data on your side. And when you have that data, you can consult and strategize on the solutions with your HR team and then propose viable solutions to your C-suite. So a few things to keep in mind once you have the power of data in your hands. Number one, gain agreement on the employee experience with your senior leadership team and especially your CEO. Why? Because once these lights on this dashboard start going off, it's going to point you in certain directions, especially and maybe in the direction of a senior leader or in the direction of their division or team And sometimes the first response is to deny and to push back and to discredit your dashboard. I've seen this time and time again, and those individuals have very loud voices at the very big table. And so discrediting can really become their first defense if not all of you are on the same page. Number two, use the dashboard as an indicator. So you know how your car has a dashboard and at times there may be a light or two that lights up. Well, after the fifth time of taking your car into the shop with the same light that's gone off, they say, oh, well, your gas cap wasn't screwed on quite tight enough and the sensor is reading that there's a problem. Now that is a true story. My point is, use the dashboard as an indicator. With data, you first want to ensure the correctness of the information that is put into the system. So always double check the data for accuracy. That's number one. Number two, conduct more thorough research before you draw any conclusions. And number three, once you are certain what the data is telling you, engage the appropriate peers to reverse the trend as soon as possible. And number four, provide ongoing training to other leaders so that you can learn and share best practices or share what not to do. Next, ensure that there is a known process for you to follow every time there is an indicator type action or trend line that is headed in the wrong direction. So based upon what I've told you thus far about the workplace and who is the highest perpetrator of abuse of diverse employees, I would keep the conversations of the indicator or negative trend line to a minimum number of people, possibly just you and the CEO, like the example that we talked about earlier, how the head of HR and the CEO sat down and discussed next steps. And maybe even, depending on the seriousness, you may want to include your legal team if warranted. Because tipping off the individual who has a possible legal action against a diverse employee is a recipe for disaster in the courts. And what typically happens, the leader immediately starts taking it out on the existing employees or ramps up firing of a diverse employee who thinks that they reported it. Remember back to the 70% who are retaliated against if they report any type of targeting, bullying, and abuse. So to protect your company and your employees, keep it as confidential as possible. Now what happens when you begin reporting out on the dashboard, and two things happen. Number one, you start seeing improvement, which is awesome. One trend line starts increasing over the course of a few quarters, and you may see engagement from senior leadership actually begin to wane. But I encourage you, do not let up. The key is to also tie these critical bottom line KPIs on your dashboard to productivity and profit if you can. Showing the direct correlation will provide the increased propensity for ongoing support. Or, let's say, for example, the trend line is getting worse and executives start questioning why you started this in the first place. Two things here. Number one, did you train and hold your leaders accountable? If you didn't train, the trend lines will probably go down and it will get much worse within your organization. Not a scenario anyone wants to see. Number two, if you did train, are you checking in and holding leaders accountable? If something is reported, is HR acting on it? If not, then fewer people report and the metrics will decline. The key here is that you cannot bypass critical steps in the process. And lastly, find ways to celebrate success, both publicly and privately. Recognition will be your greatest motivator if people experience the change and it's not based upon some faulty system that isn't capturing the actual experience. Tell stories of success intermittently. Let employees maybe nominate leaders that are displaying the right behaviors and the right type of leadership in a DE&I environment. There are so many things that you can do to reinforce your behavior, and HR should absolutely lead those efforts. So a few other baseline must-haves that you will want to take into account as you start this employee experience in your technology journey. First and foremost, you must have the board and C-suite commitment to act. Get buy-in not only on the strategy, but to the measurement, your processes of how you will act, and agree on what actions are cause for dismissal. Gain crystal clarity from all parties. Next, one of the biggest challenges companies have today with DE&I is the legal and the brand risk. Some recent legislation has made it easier for those who are victims of sexual harassment in the workplace to make their experience public. With most sexual harassment victims women, again, your brand is at risk, and if you become known for not being a diverse, friendly organization, you're going to have less chance of attracting diverse talent. Next, if you ask, you must act. Let me repeat that. If you ask, you must act 100% of the time. The quickest way to disengagement and skepticism is asking your employees for feedback. They tell you of their experience and no one does anything with the information. Or worse yet, they're retaliated against for sharing. So if you ask, you must act. Next, senior leaders love benchmarks because most are ultra competitive. So leverage your industry benchmarks as a comparison tool when you're building out your employee experience map and your technology KPIs. And lastly, the perpetrators of abuse on your diverse employees are masterful at navigating tough conversations and covering their tracks. So HR should become equally knowledgeable and masterful at identifying the truth and then acting accordingly, regardless of the level. So there are additional resources that you can leverage that are available. And here are some of the ones that I find most helpful. If you want to learn about recent DE&I lawsuits that are gaining momentum in the courts, I always encourage HR to track them on the EEOC site. It will be a proof point that you can use with senior leaders to show how you must adhere to the laws, or in some instances, you may be sued. There are also a ton of information out on GoCo's website. They are one of the leaders in technology, and they have a lot of resources for you to peruse, read, and possibly leverage as you build out your journey. Next, there are also a host of articles on the hrmorning.com website that can keep you in the know, including the most recent legislation and how to comply. And we have several Voices of HR podcasts that are dedicated to topics that you've heard today, including how to select HR technology systems, to a discussion with the author of the book Unbiased, Stacey Gordon, to how to create interview systems that remove bias and increase your percentage of diverse candidates, to how to address investigations into claims of bias, harassment, and abuse. And if you are a reader, both Unbiased by Stacey Gordon and my book, Winning the Talent Shift, are also great resources for you. And if you want to stay up to date on legislation that is currently making its way through the system, you will want to research the Healthy Workplace Bill. Most HR folks that I talked to today have never heard of this bill. It's actually been introduced in 31 states and would allow employees at all levels, ethnicities, and genders to sue their employer for targeting, bullying, and abuse experienced in their workplace. It also makes the filing public so that anyone can read the complaint. So if companies are not prepared, this could have dire consequences, and leadership will look to HR to be informed and to inform them. And now, to help you double down on your diversity efforts, we are going to raffle off 3 Winning the Talent Shift books for those of you who have joined us today. The good news is your name is already entered in the raffle, and if you are selected, 3 lucky winners will be receiving their signed book in the mail by August 25th. If you receive one, let me know what you think. You can send me an email at baldrich@bertaaldrich.com. Certainly connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I'd love to hear from you, and I hope it helps you identify where your DE&I initiatives are getting stuck and how to actually progress them forward. DE&I is such an important current and future topic for organizations, and contrary to some, DE&I is not going away. And those companies that embrace the change now will likely have exponential benefits in the future. Thank you for joining us today. We would love to hear your feedback, so please complete the survey at the end of this webinar. And if you have any further questions, do not hesitate to send them to me at baldridge@bertaaldridge.com.
Thanks, Berta. And in order to remain on schedule, we will respond to the questions that came in via chat by email in a timely manner. But again, please feel free to forward them directly to Berta. And with that, on behalf of HR Morning, I would also like to thank everyone for attending. This concludes our program.